Well, it's interesting because there's a tie to Zionism here as well.
Hmm.
The government in Venezuela that has since the early 2000s begun the process of nationalizing their country's natural resources. So we're talking about the largest oil reserves in the world, over double what Saudi Arabia has, and the largest untapped gold deposits in the world, which I think makes Venezuela especially key to the modern world, because I think BRICS and other countries that are breaking away from the dollar are going to be looking at gold as a base currency, or having gold playing a larger role in global exchange once again. And so the US, up until that point, up until this process, had basically, through US companies and European companies, dominated Venezuela's oil industry and their mining sector. And since that ended, since Venezuela started asserting its sovereignty, the US has run endless coup attempts. In 2002, they removed their first revolutionary leader, Chavez, from office with a brief military coup. But so many people went into the streets that they were forced to bring him back. More recently, there have been other periodic periods of unrest in the streets, but more recently in 2019, the Trump administration moved to recognize this shadow government in Venezuela. So this was a very odd policy where the U.S. actually declared mission accomplished in its regime change before the change in government had actually taken place. The Maduro government to this day controls the borders, the military, all of the government ministries in Caracas, and yet the U.S. recognizes a government as its legitimate government that isn't part of that regime. Why is that? Well, as a result of that policy of recognizing a shadow government, the US and our European allies have successfully frozen billions of dollars worth of Venezuelan assets, including gold bullion that was stored in the Bank of England that Maduro actually attempted to repatriate back in 2018, just a few months before the US launched this coup. So it meant that now England gets to sit on Venezuela's sovereign gold reserve holdings indefinitely, because they claim they can't figure out who actually runs the government in Venezuela. Very convenient for the British. Now they get to keep those gold reserves. But to tie it back to Zionism, Venezuela kicked out the Israelis, doesn't even have a U.S., doesn't have an Israeli embassy in Caracas, has not had relations with Israel since the 2000s. Compare that now with Javier Milei in Argentina, who took his first international trip as president to Israel, actually thanked the Chabad Lubavitch cult in New York for his victory, went and prayed to a cult leader, claiming that thanks to his belief in that cult, he was actually able to win the presidency in Argentina. He's not only sold out his country to the IMF and is accepting IMF loans, now has higher inflation than Venezuela, and is facing street protests himself. But more recently, in this past week, Javier Milei got caught shipping Argentina's sovereign gold supply offshore. Now, what kind of leader does that? I'm not sure. He wouldn't even say where it went. I'm willing to bet it was the Bank of England, but this is now a controversy in Argentina. So I think this shows two models for development or leadership in Latin America. Yes, the Venezuelan government has its own issues. They would admit that there's corruption and that they're fighting their own battles internally, but at least that it's up to them, that they're still a sovereign nation trying to get their sovereign gold reserve deposits back, as a result facing all this pressure externally, whereas Argentina, Milei, very warmly praised by Elon Musk and many figures in alternative media, but is actually in many ways selling out his nation. There's some link there too between those that are very pro-Israel on the American continent and those that are not, that would like to actually be sovereign and actually call Israel out for its war at a time like now. So I think Americans would benefit to, again, learn about Venezuela and create a rational policy there that is not just driven by these characters that want to get a slice of the country's natural resources.
Who won the Venezuelan presidential elections last week?
Well, according to the government, Maduro has declared victory, but they have yet to release their local polling data. And because of street protests and the opposition coming forward with their own polling data, saying that they didn't recognize the results, the U.S. immediately recognizing that opposition candidate again. They've turned the process over to their Supreme Court now to have all of the parties that participated turn over their polling data, and the Supreme Court is going to conduct an independent audit. But I would just say that it doesn't even matter who won the vote necessarily from the perspective of Americans, because this isn't about voting or democracy for the US. That's not really what we're basing our policy on. In fact, the opposition said before the vote took place that they would not honor the election results unless they won. And this is something that routinely happens in Venezuela. It happened in 2014, it happened in 2016, 2019, or I'm sorry, 2018. Whenever there was an election that the opposition didn't win, they go into the streets, they claim fraud, and it's created this breakdown now at a point where it doesn't even matter who wins the vote. It's just a question of who controls the military and who controls the borders, who actually can provide stability in the country. And Maduro says to the United States, he just gave a statement last week saying, look, I'm the only one that is going to prevent more migrants from coming to the border and has the ability to actually stabilize the country. He also gave a comment last week saying that, he's been frustrated because routinely when Trump was in office, Trump actually tried to reach out to meet with him. He actually revealed that when he came to the US in 2018 for the UN General Assembly meeting, that Trump tried to schedule a meeting to meet with him as the president of the United States, to meet with the president of Venezuela, but that these advisors, Bolton, Pompeo, and at the time Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of Exxon, who was Secretary of State, blocked that meeting from happening. And Maduro said this happened repeatedly throughout Trump's presidency. And so I think as Americans, we should start to ask questions about who's actually driving our policy. Is it the president? Is the commander in chief and the chief diplomat actually able to set our foreign policy? Or is it ideologues like Bolton and to be honest, foreigners? There's a large group of Miami Cubans and Venezuelans who act very similarly to the way the Israel lobby does, where they have this base and they say, we're one issue voters, and our one issue is that you have to take a hard line on Venezuela and Cuba and Latin America and try to carry out regime change operations against foreign countries. I think that doesn't make sense for the US, especially not in 2024. If you're here in the United States, you have a stake here. You should act as an American, not with an interest to go and gain control back in your home country. And right. I think going forward, this is something that we should be concerned about, because we can understand Ukraine, we can understand the Middle East and all these other regions all we want. But at the end of the day, the Americas, that's our neighborhood. Venezuela, these are the countries that we have to understand and deal with. And we should deal with them for what they are rather than what we want them to be, which is like some projection of an old, outdated neoliberal model that just doesn't catch. It just doesn't work in 2024. People aren't going along with it, whether it's Venezuela or Iran or